Just by way of introduction, for 17 years, I had co-founded and ran the main national, the U.S. alliance working on food systems issues. So working on local food and access to healthy food, especially in lower income communities. And I kind of during that period, I was really trying to pull the anti-hunger community, the food banks, and kind of folks who were working on advocacy issues, more focused on where their food was coming from, more focused on sustainability, on prevention rather than a medical model, and was pretty successful on that. I saw a lot of food banks moving in that direction, but also found a lot of resistance from some national groups who were linked to kind of big corporations. And there wasn't a lot of dialogue about the big issues, about why income inequality was continuing and growing, about whether it was a good idea to be connecting themselves with Walmart or Asda, as you call them here, whether we were really going down the right path of trying to address hunger. So those conversations weren't happening publicly, but they were happening kind of in the bars and the cafes and the hallways and the whispers. And so I decided that after I left my job in 2011 that that conversation needed to be brought out to light so we could build and we could make better connections between hunger and labor and hunger and public health and to address those issues kind of in a more frontal kind of way. So since I didn't have a job, I could say things I couldn't have said before. So I threw myself into writing a book, which is here. It's called Big Hunger, The Unholy Alliance Between Corporate America and Anti-Hunger Groups. It's from MIT Press, and it just came out in May. And we do have a few copies later on if folks are interested. So why don't and I should just say, that, why did I come across the pond to England? And I guess my joke is I really needed a British holiday in November, But honestly, I think the U.S. has been exporting a bad model, and I feel like my book is a warning sign about what could go wrong. And I've been looking for some inspiration as well, because I think you folks are having a much interesting conversation and dialogue about these issues than we are in the U.S., where things are much more entrenched. So I am really interested in learning more about what's going on here and what we can take back. So with that, I'm just going to move forward and start on with it. Just a few quotes to get with it. And I'm going to start with my son, and this is Orion. He was in 3rd grade at the time. He's now in 9th grade, and he doesn't look like this anymore. He's got a little mustache, he's got a deep voice, and he's kind of addicted to his phone. So Orion in 3rd grade came home one day before Christmas, and he was so excited. He was like, there's a food drive going on in my class, and the class that gets the heaviest food and raises the most money gets a pizza party, right? Great thing to motivate a 3rd grader. And so he starts scouring the cupboard looking for the heaviest food possible. Right, so we give him a few cans or whatever to take back to his class for this food drive, and all's good. And then a week later, it's a deadline, and the bin's not full. So he comes back, and he's like, "Mom, Dad," he's like, he was saying he knew I was going to the grocery store, so it's like, "Dad, you got to get me some heavy food." So I'm like, "Okay, Ryan, I'll look for some heavy food for you," right? So I'm at the grocery store. I'm thinking about what's the kind of the dollar per weight ratio of food, and what's cheap but heavy. And I'm going, well, a 2-liter bottle of Coke is heavy, right? I could get him that. I couldn't really bring myself to do it, but so I ended up getting him. So there's some beans that were on sale. So I ended up getting him some of that. And I should, before I get going, I should say that Orion, there was a happy ending for Orion. He did get his pizza party, not because his class raised the biggest weight in food, but because somebody wrote a check, a big check, and they raised the most money. So anyway, so as I was at the grocery store, I was just thinking about this, and it's going, there's just something that was really bugging me about the food drive in Orion's class. And I realized it was a microcosm of what I felt was wrong with the emergency food system, with food banks. And that's that they typically measure their effectiveness by the weight of the pounds that they distribute and the number of people that they serve. And in the U.S., the heavier the food, the better. The more pounds that they distribute, the more they feel like they're being successful. And they've got to increase their poundage every year. Typical strategic plans will be like, we're going to do 5% more this year than we did last year. And that's their measurement of success. And in some ways, I really feel like it's a measurement of failure, that they're not preventing hunger from happening in the first place. So, poundage distributed poundage distributed, and people served are not outcome measures. They're outputs. They're not measuring impact. And that, this goes beyond a logic model. It really cuts at the very core of the confusion of what's wrong with emergency food. And that's that food is the solution to hunger only in the most temporary and illusory of ways. Just because you give somebody a bag of food today, you're going to solve their problem for the next 2 or 3 days, but you're not going to solve it down the road. So when you don't link those systemic solutions with the temporary solutions or the daily solutions, you're just perpetuating the problem. You're just kicking the can down the road. And, just by way of example, you've got to address the underlying issues, I guess is the point here. So growth is not always good. Hunger is a symptom of poverty, and it is itself linked to political power. Among other causes, racism, sexism, poor educational system, and ultimately capitalism are to blame. And a box of free food is really a poor substitute for political power. So in the U.S., food charity has been growing by leaps and bounds since the early 1980s. At that point, we had a very deep recession. President Reagan came in, he slashed the food stamp program. We had high unemployment. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which is kind of halfway between New York and Chicago, which was kind of the epicenter of the steel industry at the time, between Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Youngstown. It's where a lot of steel was getting produced. It fell apart around 1980, 1981. The steel industry just, completely closed down in my town because of Japanese imports and because industry moved south to states where they weren't unionized. So overnight, 20%, 30% unemployment. So what happened in places like Youngstown and what is now the Rust Belt is these food banks started popping up. And they started popping up from labor unions, from churches, from civic associations. And they were meant to be a temporary response, an emergency response to what was considered a social emergency, essentially. Nobody expected they would last so long. Everybody thought, this was something we're going to be doing for a few years till we get ourselves out of this crisis, and we'll move on. And it was a response to a neoliberal agenda, but it reinforced that neoliberal agenda, I think, is the important point here. So I want to take a step back and talk about how things work in the U.S. in terms of the emergency food system, because it is quite more established and institutionalized than it is in the UK. So Feeding America is the national hub for food banks. It's kind of a trade association, if you will, of food banks. It's located in Chicago. It has 200 food bank members within its network, and they serve 60,000 agencies or food pantries and soup kitchens. They serve 46 million people. Come to a food bank some point during the year. About $5 billion worth of food, or about 4 billion meals a year. The food comes from various places. USDA, Department of Agriculture, buys commodities from farmers and buys primarily commodities from manufacturers who process them into peanut butter, into pasta, into canned fruits and veg, and they distribute them to schools and to food banks. So about 20%, roughly 20% of what food banks distribute, and it varies, but depending on the food bank, comes from government commodities. The rest of it comes from post-supermarket waste, food processor waste, the bulk of it. There's some in places from produce terminals, from farms. Food banks are increasingly purchasing more and more food because industry is wasting less. And then a small percentage is coming from prepared food recovery, and very small amounts are coming from food drives, like in Orion's class. So it varies radically what goes on from food bank to food bank. In California, because it's a very produce-rich state, half to 2/3 of what food banks are distributing is produce, and it's pretty high-quality stuff. It may just be cosmetically blemished or not fit marketing codes. Food banks in major cities can be quite large, and I'll give you an example of the Greater Boston Food Bank. Which is kind of a very traditional, large-scale, it markets itself as a highly efficient food bank. Its warehouse is 117,000 square feet, which is the size of a hugest big box retail store. It has refrigerators that are 2 stories tall. It has a freezer you can drive a forklift through. It costs $35 million to build this building, and has the best software of any it has comparable software of any food business in the country. It distributed 54 million pounds of food in 2015, $20 million cash budget. Again, about $54 million worth of food in 2016. And its CEO makes about $350,000 a year, of which $90,000 is an incentive because she met her poundage goals. So for her, there's a very clear goal. It's a business structure, and they pride themselves on being a business. So she met their targets and exceeded those targets, so she got quite a large incentive for doing so. So her incentives are not about shortening the line or reducing the number of people there. They're about what we call feeding the need. So, this appears, food banks appear to the public to be a private sector response, but really they're a private-public partnership. I calculated there's about $1 billion a year of public subsidies that go into food banks, and they take 3 or 4 different forms. The first one is called TFAP. It's an acronym for the Emergency Food Assistance Program. And that's a government commodity. So in 2015, the government put in about $680 million worth of cash and food into the system. So that's food that they're purchasing, and then it gives food banks some money to move that food for administrative costs. Companies get a tax credit of about 100, every time they donate food to a food bank, they get a tax credit halfway between wholesale and retail, which is about $200 million a year. And then there's about 37 states, 37 out of 50 states that provide tax credits or earmark some support for food banks. One example is just Massachusetts, where Boston is. They provide about $15 million to the Boston Food Bank to buy food for the food banks around the state. So the sector just is continuing to grow. It's grown quite a bit from its initial start in the early 80s. And there were a few food banks before then, but that was really when things took off. And I feel like it's growing by popular demand. And that's not the demand of the people, but it's the demand of the volunteers who feel good because it makes them feel like they're ending hunger. It's the demand of the corporate donors who get tax breaks. 80 to 100 million people in the US donate food at some point during the year through food drives like in my kid's school. And it grows, companies get the halo effect from the donation. And then the right wing can point to it as a rationale for privatizing our national anti-hunger response. So Jan Poppendieck, who wrote a great book in 1998 called Sweet Charity, talks about fighting hunger as a national pastime. So I just went online the other day and just Googled, out hunger, and I started to find a zillion images. And these are the types of activities that are going on across the country in every possible sector you can imagine of society. People are doing, charitable activities. They're doing, whatever it might be, bowling, bowl-a-thons, whatever it might be, to raise money for food banks. So it's become very much kind of an integral part of the American civic society. So, this is wonderful on some level. On some level, it's great to see Americans being really generous, to being very kind and caring about their neighbors and being community-oriented. But on the other hand, we've been doing this for 35 years. Hasn't made a difference, right? Are we going down the right path? What's the collateral damage? What are the effects of it? Are we stuck in a rut? Why do we keep doing relief work when maybe we should be doing development work? So there's a great book called Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton, who writes about, he's done a lot of work in international aid. He comes from a faith perspective, but he writes about, when you keep doing relief work over and over, and you really should be moving again into kind of more of a development phase, you get toxic charity, you get toxic results. And I want to talk a little bit about my own experiences with that. So in researching this book, I decided I needed to volunteer at a food pantry, because I never had. So I live in Portland, Oregon. I called up my friends at the Oregon Food Bank, which is a great group. I think they're one of the more thoughtful groups around. And I asked them, where should I go? Tell me the best food pantry in my part of town. So they pointed me to a food bank. We call what you guys call food banks, we call food pantries. So I went to a food pantry a few miles from my house. It's what's called a shopping pantry. So it's a consumer choice model. So it's not just here's a box of food. It's laid, half of the basement of the church is laid out like a grocery store. It's got coolers, it's got shelves. You walk in there with your shopping cart and you can take you can take certain things based upon your household size and regulations rules that they set up. So, so I go in there, I get my orientation from this girl this teenage girl, and she tells me that my role is to be a cross between a personal shopper, right? I'm there to help people navigate the system, and a security guard, because I'm there to make sure nobody takes too much. Got it. So I do a 4-hour shift, and I'm, halfway through my shift, I come upon my next set of clients who are an elderly African-American couple, and they're looking tired and they're looking dejected because they've been sitting there for 2 hours waiting their turn. So, I grab a shopping cart, I throw some boxes in it, I introduce myself, and I ask them their household size, and I start taking them down the aisle, which sounds like we're getting married. I start taking them down the aisle, and I start telling them what they can take. They can take a can of tuna and, 3 cans of beans and a thing of spaghetti and 6 potatoes or whatever it was. And as they're figuring out what they want, I'm sitting there looking in their shopping cart to making sure they're not taking too much, right? Because I got those security guard instructions in my head. And I catch myself doing that, and I go, this is stupid. Why are you doing this? And so I take a couple steps back to give them some space, and I realize I'm still doing it. I realize I'm still hovering over their shopping cart, making sure they don't take a damn extra potato. And at that point, I realized that there's this inherent power dynamic, inherent racism in the food system, in the emergency food system. I'm white, I'm middle class. I'm making sure that this poor African-American couple, they're down on their luck. They're just trying to get enough food to make it through the week. They're not taking a few extra potatoes. I felt like I was just recreating these centuries of oppression in the United States. So, it was a thoroughly uncomfortable experience. But, I think it's, it's something that kind of recreated itself time and time again when throughout my volunteer stint there. Not exactly in the same way, but I was constantly encouraged to kind of tussle with the recipients, with the clients. The staff and the volunteers would tell me, watch out for Mary. Mary's going to come in and she's really good at stealing meat. So Mary would come in, she'd put 2 extra things of chicken in her shopping cart. I'd take them out. There's those kinds of battles that I'd be having with people all the time. And it was a really, uncomfortable experience that I felt put into. So after I did that stint, I decided I really needed to kind of be on the other side of the coin, right? So I had never relied on a food pantry because I've grown up pretty middle class and, just never had to do it. So I, again, went back to my friends at Oregon Food Bank, called them up and said, where do I go? So they pointed me to a food pantry on the other side of town. So I go there, and it's also in a church. I'm in the parking lot waiting for the doors to open, and I run into somebody I know. And I went, God damn it. And it's this guy, Charles. And Charles and I were on the Food Policy Council together. He lives in the neighborhood. And I didn't want him to bust me because I was kind of going undercover, right? I didn't want him to go, hey, Andy, you're writing a book. What are you doing here? And so I call him over to the side of the building. I'm like, come here, Charles, come here. I need to talk to you. And, we go over to the side of the building. Before I can even say anything, he says, look, Andy, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I had some people staying in my house. They eat me out of house and home. I have to come here sometimes. Don't feel bad about it. And I wasn't even tracking that. I wasn't thinking about that stigma that Charles was trying to kind of allay for me. I was just trying not to get busted. But I think both of those, cases really point out to kind of the inherent indignity of food banks. I want to reinforce that a little bit with a PSA that Feeding America, that Food Banking Hub put out from 2013. They've done a couple of these like this. I want you to pay attention to who has wings in this PSA, in this video, and who doesn't. And then we can talk a little bit about it.
Every day across America, excess food is gathered by a network of good people at local food banks, giving hope to millions of children who struggle with hunger. They've earned their wings, and you can too. Together, we can solve child hunger. Support Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Okay, so what did you guys pick up there?
Food bank users don't have the wings, of course.
Food bank users don't have the wings. So what does that tell you?
Must be planting their own crop. Is the subtext.
Right. Yeah, the volunteers are angels in a very basic level, and the recipients aren't. So, it's who's deserving and who's not deserving. It kind of reinforces that trope in our society about the undeserving poor.
It's the power dynamic we're talking about as well. So the angels are sort of representatives from God, which implies, they have a sense of power in this context. And the food bank users are the sort of mere humans who are more sort of passive towards these angelic figures.
I like being in universities. Have smart people. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I haven't heard that one before, but you're absolutely right. So, the quote I like to kind of reinforce this with is from Robert Egger, whose smiling face is there. He's a social entrepreneur from LA. And he talks about charity being about the redemption of the giver, not the liberation of the receiver. I think that video really encapsulates that video well. So, on some level, if we give up our dignity but we're fed, that would be a price, right? I mean, that would be a trade-off we could pay. But, charity's not really all that effective in ending hunger. And reducing food insecurity in the United States, and neither are our social security programs or our federal food programs. They're needed, but they're not sufficient. So in the U.S., we measure food insecurity. We do it through an 18-question survey that's passed out every year through the Department of Agriculture and the Census Bureau. They've started doing it, and it's a survey. It's a questions that measures behaviors and experiences. Things like, did you have enough food this month? Did you run out of food? Do you get anxious about it? Do you change what you're eating? Did you skip meals? Did you skip meals so your kids could eat? Stuff like that. So they've been doing that since 1995. And in 1995, then you can take a look at the green line. Started at 12%. Very low food security was at 4%. Ebbs and flows, right? The economy went south in 2007, right? So food insecurity shoots up slowly as the economy is recovering, slowly trickling back down. But still, 20 years later, latest numbers from 2016 are pretty much identical. We haven't made progress over the past 20 years, right? This is not progress. This is treading water. This is stagnation. So the question is why? Why? What are we doing wrong, or what are we not doing enough of? And it's because, if you talk to economists, they'll tell you that it's about wages. It's about people not getting enough hours to work. It's unstable labor. So the buying power of the minimum wage in the U.S. peaked in 1968. And if it had kept up with productivity, it would be about $18 an hour right now. It's about the national minimum wage is $7.25. Various states have higher minimum wages that go up to about $12 an hour. You can basically still work full time if you're a family of two and at the minimum wage and qualify for the food stamp program, qualify for federal benefits. So it's the working force. 4/5 of people who get food stamps have a wage earner in their household. It's not the lazy shiftabouts, the gadabouts. It's folks who are working, a job or two at McDonald's or Walmart or where have you, and they can't make ends meet because their wages are so low, and they can't get enough hours. No, they can't get full-time work. So, going back to that slide about food banks, there's 200 food banks, 60,000 food pantries, 80 to 100 million donors, 46 million people being served. What are they doing about this problem? Are they working on this problem? And not. I started looking at their policy advocacy stances. A lot of them do advocate on the food stamp program. But most of them stay in what I call a nutrition safety zone. They stay in a place where they can advocate on nutrition programs, which aren't that controversial in the U.S. There is in Congress a lot of controversy, but at the local level, not so much. They can stay in that nutrition safety zone, and where they don't alienate their donors, where they don't alienate their board members, where they can stay, as Gloria from Hartford, Connecticut says, mainstream, rich, and respectable. So I started to ask, why? Why, I started talking to my friends in food banks. Why? You guys know that wages are essential to reducing food insecurity and reducing income inequality. Why are you not working on this stuff? And the one thing that kept coming up was, well, we want to, but when we take these issues up to our board of directors, they don't let us. They come from the grocery industry. They come from industries that are very sensitive to labor price increases that harms their profitability. They're not going to, allow the food bank to take a stand on something that's antithetical to their business interests. So I go, okay, all right, fine, let's look at that. So I dragged my son into doing some research because he can't get off his phone. So I figure he loves to look at the screen, so I might as well get him to do something productive. So we looked at every food bank website in the country, 200 food banks in the Feeding America network, created a big spreadsheet, found 160 data on about 157 of those food banks have employment affiliation for their board members. So where do the board members work? 2,586 board members. Found out that about a quarter, between a fifth and a quarter, work at a Fortune 1000 company, one of the 1,000 biggest companies in the country, or a private sector equivalent. Revenues of about $1.8 billion or more. But only two out of those 2,500 worked for a labor union. So they're much more integrated into corporations than they are into labor. These are the companies that have the highest number of their employees on food bank boards. So you can see, and the other part of this is that there are not a lot of clients on food bank boards. You don't see food banks putting in their, the food insecure, the food pantry clients into their boards. And there's not a lot of racial or ethnic diversity as well. They tend to be white. They tend to be, upper middle class folks who are, can help raise money for the organization. So then the other part I started to look at, and I don't know if I didn't put a slide in on this. So I started to look at the salaries of food bank CEOs, and I found that a lot of them were making $200,000 or more. So they're very much entrenched, as that woman from Boston Food Bank was. They're very much entrenched in their organizations, and there's not a lot of incentives for them to give up that well-paying of a job and put themselves out of business, as they often talk about. So the point here is that food banking work has become big business, and big business profits from food banks. And the clearest example to that is Walmart, or again, Asda. So in the US, Walmart has a huge PR problem because they've taken the low road toward profitability. They've been kept out of major metropolitan areas like Chicago, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Seattle. All tried to keep them at bay and reduce their presence in the town because they're driving local businesses out and because they pay so poorly. A congressional study from 2014 found that Walmart's low wages were costing taxpayers $6 billion a year in public benefits, and housing vouchers and health care and also nutrition programs. So we're subsidizing Walmart's profits as taxpayers by that amount. So what does Walmart do? They put a lot of money into their philanthropic arm, into Walmart Foundation. In 2010, they made a commitment of $2 billion to the anti-hunger sector in cash and mainly product. They more than exceeded that, as you can see. These are three of the main anti-hunger groups in the country. That's how much money they pulled in from Walmart during that time period. Which is great. In some ways this is great because I'd much rather have these guys get the money than the Walton family, right? Walton family's got $100 billion. They don't need a few million more. But what Walmart is doing, it's using its philanthropy as a way to game the system and increase its profits. For a way for them to be considered a hunger fighter rather than a hunger causer. So let me explain that to you. So what Walmart does is Walmart pays its workers sub-living wages. Now it's $9 to $10 an hour. They're then encouraging their workers to go to food pantries, encouraging them to get on SNAP so they can make ends meet because they don't give them enough hours either. And don't let them get other jobs because their hours are unstable. And then Walmart is the single largest redeemer of food stamps in the country. Again, back in 2014, they redeemed $13 billion, 18% of food stamps. So they're paying their workers sub-living wages, encouraging them to go on food stamps, and then cashing in their food stamps and profiting off it. On top of that, they get tons of earned media. Every time they make a donation of $50,000 to a food bank or $100,000 to a food bank, they're getting an article in the local newspaper and the local media, local TV, touting them as a wonderful corporate citizen. As a result, their stock prices go up, and it makes it easier for them to enter into those urban areas because they're essentially buying the political neutrality of their recipients in doing so. And one really clear example of that is in 2013, Walmart was trying to get into Washington, D.C., into the market there. The city council was reluctant to do so, but they passed this legislation saying if you want to come in, you've got to have a minimum wage of $12.50 an hour. Better than minimum, but still moving towards a living wage. The mayor actually unfortunately vetoed it, but the point here is that there's lots of anti-hunger groups in Washington, D.C. Work at the local level, work at the federal level. A lot of them are getting 6- and 7-figure grants from Walmart. None of them stood up for that piece of legislation. None of them said, this is a good piece that's going to improve the food security and the income of our constituents. They know where their bread's buttered. They wouldn't do it. So instead, what we get are, I'm going to show you this partnership between Walmart and Feeding America and these other food manufacturers. This is an ad that came out this spring. That's just it's one of these cause marketing partnerships, where you buy a can of soup and the company will donate a few pennies to the charity, and the charity and Feeding America in this case got $9 million out of it. So I want you to pay attention to the food that's being promoted in this ad.
What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on? Oh, baby, all I need is my baby.
So would Joe Cocker be rolling around in his grave? Now, this is a stoner song in my generation, right? So anyways, what kind of foods did you see?
Sugary foods.
Sugary foods like Pop-Tarts. It's highly processed, manufactured stuff that, we're in the middle of an obesity and diabetes epidemic. This is not the stuff you want to be promoting people to be eating. So, it's what's the ethics of it is what I ask, Is it okay to be fundraising for the poor by promoting unhealthy food? And, the same thing happened here in England, where last year Fair Share partnered with Coke to be promoting people to buy Coke and taking a snapshot of the Coke bottle, and they would get 25p out of it. So, again, back in the U.S., it's not just Feeding America and Walmart. It's lots of other companies and organizations. We've got a group called Share Our Strength that does a lot of kind of cooking education with people, with low-income folks. They're working on childhood hunger. They don't advocate for the minimum wage, but they partner with a group called the National Restaurant Association, which is the primary organization that's lobbying against raising the minimum wage. There's a group called Hunger Free America that runs a kind of a service corps program for youth, and it is funded by Pepsi. There's the main lobbying group in the States is called the Food Research and Action Center. They lobby with the soda industry to allow them to continue to take soda within the food stamp program. They tried to get Harvard School of Public Health to stop publishing research that's critical of their work. So it's become an unholy alliance. It's become this hunger industrial complex, which is like the military industrial complex. There's just not a lot of incentives to end hunger in the country. And that impact is, it goes beyond how we fail to address hunger. I want to just kind of talk about our recent elections, and Trump's on everybody's mind. But, anti-hunger groups have not been working on minimum wage. They've not been working on getting the jobs back in my hometown and in places in the Rust Belt. And the place I grew up in Youngstown, right north of it it's a county called Trumbull County. It's a very blue collar kind of place. It's got an auto assembly plant. Had a lot of steel workers there, and I went to school with the kids of steel workers who had a pretty middle class life when I was growing up. They'd send their kids to college and they'd make middle class salary, and maybe they had a boat or they went on vacation up to the lake. And now their kids are now working at Walmart or at the private prison in the community. And they're trying to make ends meet by going to the food bank or getting on food stamps. And they want a return to the good old days. So Trumbull County has always voted Democratic, except in 1972 is the last time I voted for a Republican, for Richard Nixon. And I voted for Trump this year. So I keep wondering if, what's the role of the anti-hunger community, because they didn't challenge the dominant paradigm. They didn't about neoliberalism. They didn't work on wages or industrial policy or income inequality. All they did is say, well, we're sorry you're poor, but you can get food stamps or you can go to charity, both of which are stigmatizing. So people rejected that. And so I think there's kind of bigger hell to pay for our failures as a movement. So, apart from these corporate relations, I think, apart from this issue of economic justice, to be honest, the anti-hunger community is really changing in a lot of positive ways. And that those changes need to get accelerated. And one example is that 30% of school kids in the country now can get an item that's locally grown through farm-to-school programs. In Florida, there's a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that is putting pressure on fast food companies, and food service companies and supermarkets to pay an extra penny per pound for tomatoes and peppers and strawberries that are picked on the East Coast. And they're doing a lot of great work to eliminate human trafficking in that area, to give workers more rights in bathrooms and reduce sexual harassment, but also essentially doubling their salaries. So they're a great organizing tool. We're seeing also, this is a Freedom 90s, also a really interesting case study in Ontario in Canada, which is, it's made up of kind of the little old ladies who've been volunteering at the church pantries for 20 years. And, they're very committed to their communities. They very much, want to make sure that people don't go hungry. But, they've been doing it for 20 years and they're like, we don't want to be doing this for 20 more years. And they want to retire by the time they're 90, right? That's what the Freedom 90 kind of refers to. So they've been putting pressure on the province government in Ontario to be putting more money into social assistance programs, to be starting pilots on universal basic income. And they've been doing it in a way that I think is kind of funny. They've been kind of trying to use humor. They have the song, Paul Simon's song, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. They have 50 Ways to Close the Food Bank. They have, since they're a union, they have three demands. One of which is mandatory retirement by the age of 90. Mandatory layoffs, freeze our salaries or double our wages. We don't care because we're unpaid volunteers. I think it's a really powerful way to organize just regular folks into kind of a social movement to make claims on the state. And then the other thing is, really, there's a lot of change going on in the food banking world. There's kind of a thing where about maybe a third of the food banks are getting into really interesting work, to that kind of community and economic development. Just one example is in Rochester, New York, which is up on the lake, kind of by Toronto. They have it's an apple growing area, and the kids in the schools there weren't getting apples from the region. They're getting apples from Washington State, 3,000 miles away. And they weren't eating them. So they started to buy apples from the local farmers, processing them, training people, and giving people job skills and jobs, selling the apples, slices into the schools. Kids are loving them. And it's creating money for the farmers, creating money for creating jobs. It's creating a little bit of income for the food bank, which are reinvesting into things like catering businesses, where they can do more job training and provide healthy meals for schools. So this type of program is happening a lot in the United States, where there are food banks are starting to kick the soda out. They're starting to kind of be more conscious about how they evaluate their success and focus on healthy food rather than just any food, where they're starting to take up some more policy advocacy and getting involved in gardens and food policy councils and kind of more community building, using food as a community building tool. And it's very promising, and the work really needs to be accelerated and institutionalized. So, just to kind of wrap this up, I think we really need to take hunger back from corporations, who are using their efforts just to bolster their images, but they're still perpetuating the problems. And we need to hold food banks and their corporate partners accountable for the damage they do to public health, to dignity, and our collective ability to actually solve hunger, not just perpetuate the problem. So we've been tinkering around the edges for too long. And the charitable food sector has inherent weaknesses, structural weaknesses in it that we really need to address. So I am not, in the US, I can't say shut down the food banks because, there's 46 million people who depend upon them, and there'll be some real human suffering if that were to happen. But we need to bend down the growth curve. It's been on this exponential growth curve for 35, 40 years. Every year, it's just kind of more and more and more and more. We need to start figuring out a way to bend down that curve so that we start putting more money and time and energy and resources into preventing hunger, into shortening the line, into getting people not to be poor in the first place and not needing food banks, and to be doing more community education around that. So we need to be making food banking obsolete. It took us 35 years to get here. It's going to take us some time to get back out of it. So we need to be stopping canned food drives. We need to be putting an increasing portion of food bank budgets into upstream causes. So the last part I will say around that I think really needs to happen is around leadership. The leadership of the anti-hunger community, especially the higher up you go, I imagine it's the same everywhere, tends to be very white, very professional, very male especially. Tends to be people who look like me, honestly. So there is not enough participation of impoverished folks in advising and setting the priorities and being staff and being on the boards of these organizations. The Poverty Truth Commission is something I ran into when I was up in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and I thought that was brilliant. That was a fantastic idea. That's the type of thing we need to be working on, is building those relationships between legislators and folks who are relying on food banks in the first place. So I think I'm going to leave it with that and let Chris and Maddie have their say. So thank you.
Sorry, you go first. Okay. What, from your time in the UK, what have you made in the situation here in terms of ours echoing you? Or?
I'm envious. I'm envious because the dialogue, the discourse here is just so different. You have, people who are realizing that that food banks are not the way to go, that they're not acceptable, that they're a symptom of the failure and not a testament to the charity of the generosity of people. So I think you guys are at an incipient phase that we have a lot to learn from. In the back?
Yeah, the problem is that more people are using food banks now than before. It's going up and up and up in this country.
Yeah, and you've got this, I keep hearing about the rollout of UC and how, Trussell Trust is saying that food bank usage has grown by 70 or 80% over the past year. So I think I'm perceiving this as a critical moment in what's going on, in which you need to either, again, bend that usage curve back down again and try to move towards, if not an elimination of food banks, but at least make them, smaller, or they're just going to get institutionalized.
It's government policy in this country.
Right. So that's right, and that's, I guess, the effort that you all have to do to kind of hold the government accountable for its policies. I mean, no, I'm saying it's easier said than done, right? But it's a political struggle, right?
Did you deal with any of the overseas programs like this? Because what I've seen is that the government stands up and says, oh, we're trying to end poverty here and here and here, and doing worse at home.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting they shouldn't be sending aid to other places, but they're convinced that they can end poverty in Africa in 20 years,
Right.
and it's getting worse right where we live.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, the Millennium Development Goals, which hunger was halved across the world and during roughly the same time period in the U.S. in which we're not making much progress at all. What I do look at is the parallels between international food aid and domestic food aid. In the U.S., we don't talk about our food programs as food aid. They have kind of a different set of language. People don't think about them in the same breath, but I really, as I did this research, I began to realize that our food stamp program, or SNAP as it's called, is tied aid. It's essentially the same thing as us shipping grain to a third world country to prevent famine there, instead of just giving them money, as the rest of the world does. Because it supports American agricultural industry. The SNAP program, the food stamp program, instead of giving cash to people and letting them make their own decisions, we're giving them a debit card that they can use at the supermarket, which supports the supermarket industry and American processors. So we need to figure out how to kind of move both of those in a different direction.
Do you think there's any chance of America moving away from the very capitalist society that it's stuck in, and we seem to be following hell-bent?
Not in my lifetime, unfortunately.
Can I just ask, you mentioned universal basic income, and it's something that I'm really interested in the idea of. What are your thoughts on that in relation to, you mentioned jobs, we need to get jobs back into certain areas.
Yeah.
Even if that happens, do you think it would be great to go a step further? And if we could have an ideal world?
Everything I'm reading about, I'm a newbie to universal basic income, to studying it, and from an initial look at it, it looks fantastic, right? I think I love the universality of it, and that it's not means tested. In the United States, I think the devil would be in the details, in terms of how much people would get. Would they be better off than the existing suite of programs there are now? Or would it be a way for the right wing to kind of chip away at those programs through one easy kind of one-stop shop?
Yes, definitely. And you mentioned Richard Nixon, and he actually he was on the cusp of actually implementing.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, thinking about his political background, so you can see why.
And Richard Nixon implemented a number of the federal nutrition programs. So, even a Republican back then was, much more progressive than a Republican now.
Question over.
Your clips that you showed earlier about, the schools buying apples locally and so on, and the Freedom 90 movement, do you not think to a certain extent that is also tinkering around the edges? We're talking about food banks tinkering around the edges of hunger.
Uh-huh.
That then becomes another way of tinkering around the edges to make something that's bad a bit better. And then there'll be another set of tinkering around the edges. I think that we need a whole cultural shift where people are so offended and ashamed by hunger. And we certainly haven't got that in this country. You might think there's a debate going on, but we've certainly got a government that's trying to stop it at every corner,
Right.
And especially with universal credit. The fact that there's this idea that, you can have a universal credit leaving people with no food on the table at all, and they don't seem to think that there's anything wrong with that. And if you're struggling, you can borrow a little bit of money because
Right.
you've vouched for something so you have to pay it back. Do you not think we need something bigger than being small in the woods?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. I do point to, I'm really entranced by the idea of Freedom 90 for one reason. We have, like I said, tens of millions of people who are involved in supporting food banks in the United States. And they're a potential huge audience if they were mobilized, potential huge political force if they're mobilized. If we can, and obviously there's a big difference between somebody who's in it for charity and feels good about donating a few cans of beans versus somebody who's going to write a letter to Parliament or Congress. That's a big step. But the potential for mobilizing the recipients, the institute, there's this huge network and huge infrastructure to mobilize that infrastructure and to educate people through that infrastructure is enormous, and it's a huge untapped political force. How successful it would be, I don't know. They would certainly alienate some of their donors if food banks went down that path. So I think I salivate, I guess, as an organizer. I salivate at that prospect. In terms of food banks kind of tinkering around the edges, I think they're much more. I talk about we need to move to a vision of anti-hunger work being kind of a three-legged stool about public health, local economies, and economic justice. And I think food banks are much more comfortable and are moving into kind of more of a space around public health and local food systems. They're much more comfortable doing that because it doesn't alienate their donors. Nonetheless, the engine that drives the train is still very much the food distribution. That's what brings the money in. That's the bulk of what they're doing. And they're finding it very, very hard. Most of them are finding it very, very hard to work on economic justice issues because of their relationships with donors and because they have this very bipartisan coalition their audience is very much across society. So they're challenged to do that. So I think they're moving in the right direction. Is it tinker on the edges? Sorta. I mean, I don't know how to answer this. I mean, I think there's a conference I went to in Seattle. There was 600 progressive food bankers, the most progressive food bankers, and they had a keynote speech from a gentleman from Detroit. His name is Malik Yakini, and he made it very clear that he had a great quote. That says, "You can't be anti-hunger and pro-capitalist. That there's an inherent contradiction with capitalism and hunger." So I think but I think food banks as social service agencies are having a very hard time grappling with that.
I've done some work on local food in West Yorkshire in the last few years. I'm just wondering we've got things here called local food strategies. I'm just wondering about how influential food policy councils are in North America in this area.
There's about 200 food policy councils in the country. Some are better organized than others. Some are very effective and some aren't. They all do include, folks who are working in the anti-hunger community. I think they've been more focused on things that are a little bit easier to address. And they were focused on coordination and communication and networking and some policy change. A lot of them have been much more focused on access to healthy food because we have a lot of food deserts and it's hard in many neighborhoods for people to find fruits and veggies. So
similar here as well. Yeah.
Similar, yeah. So addressing kind of the more structural issues doesn't really work so well.
I was very interested in some of the sort of CEO salaries and the corporate structures of the food bank. Could you give us a sort of whistle-stop tour, I guess, of how it got so bad? Because I guess these things started, as you say, when the neoliberal revolution kicked off. But initially, it's going to be small groups working with local churches, right? And I don't know, small organisations, independent. How did it get so bad and so out of control?
I mean, it just kept, I think it's just a gradual institutionalization and professionalization. And it's something that we've seen all across the American nonprofit sector, where there's been a push for philanthrocapitalism to incorporate business practices into nonprofits. And with that, with bringing in board members from the food industry, which is in some ways is very logical, right? I mean, this is these institutions are distributing food. Their peers are those in the grocery industry in some ways. At least that's the way they see it. So they bring their expertise, they bring their technology, they bring their business practices into those food banks. It's been encouraged by Feeding America, has been very central in playing that role. They give awards and they give bonus points and access to funding and grants for capital, for software, for for transportation, but a lot of it is based upon efficiency. So that's been their key metric is, how efficient are you at distributing food? And you have to distribute X number of pounds per food per person in poverty in your service area. So they'll all encourage that growth to meet these goals that they have. So it's been, the salaries in some ways are inflated because the way food banks market themselves and think about themselves is their budget isn't just their cash, it's their cash plus the food, the value of the food they distribute. So Feeding America, for example, is a $120 million organization, but they distribute $2 billion worth of food, so they call themselves a $2 billion organization, and then the salary, a half a $1,000,000 salary for their CEO doesn't seem so large when you think of it in that context.
And I suppose following on from that, do you have any suggestions for us? I think Chris might pick up on this in his talk, because I think this institutionalisation, professionalisation and the business practices are starting to take root in here. Is there any way you've learned that we can maybe cut this process, short-circuit it in some way?
Kneecap it, huh? That's a great question. I don't know. I have to think about that. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, hi, Jeff Tansey. I chaired the Fabian Commission on Food and Poverty, which you know, Andy.
Yes.
And I think there are three big things that are going on to follow up for that, and which hopefully could be used to stop this institutionalisation. One is the End Hunger UK campaign, which has been led jointly by Oxfam and Church Action on Poverty. The second is a lottery-funded project on food power, which is providing money for local bottom-up work to tackle the roots of food and poverty and address that. And the third is there is a bill in Parliament there's a reading of a proposed bill in Parliament on the 29th of November on measuring food insecurity, which we don't do in the UK. They do it a bit in Northern Ireland. They're going to do it full scale in Scotland, but they're doing it a little bit at the moment. So in the sense that you're issuing a warning, don't go down the US route. Yeah. And I think there are things now that if it can connect those together, gives us a better chance of avoiding going down that route. And there will be a launch of a menu, rather than a manifesto or anything, to tackle food insecurity, which does not include food banks in it, because it's recognised by the groups supporting that, which does include FIRSHA, that this is not a solution to the problem. It's a sticking plaster on the problem.
Thank you. Okay.
Just slightly contradictory in the last point, but when we turn it around eventually. It seems to be one of the advantages of the American system is it's decentralised, it promotes, obviously the states have a lot of power to do things, it promotes diversity in responses. And we're seeing that, for example, now in the American states' response to Trump's repudiation of the Paris Agreement and so on in global warming. I just wonder if there are things going on. I was thinking particularly, taking up the point about universal basic income, but there's anything going on to kind of apply that philosophy to food as well. What about a universal basic supermarket or something like that? We just simply go along and the food's there.
Yeah.
Is there anything like that going on in the States around?
That's a wonderful question. Not that I can think of. The market holds such force and such primacy. There's been a lot of efforts to incentivize the market in the right direction. Just thinking about supermarkets, there's been there's federal money coming down to incentivize. Various states have programs to incentivize, through tax credits or reduce business fees or things like that in that area. No, I mean, it's hard because so much money does come down. I mean, federal food programs are $85 billion. SNAP is $66 billion. So some states have, over time, passed legislation to, pay an extra 5 cents a pound or 5 cents a meal for school lunches for in-state grown products. Or California, for example, had legislation a long time ago to give immigrants who are cut off of the food stamp program because of restrictive regulations kind of a state-run program. You're seeing it more in the kind of the healthcare structure. I think Maine just passed a universal healthcare legislation. California is considering the same thing. That's maybe where things are being tinkered around more, because that's such in crisis right now. Okay.
Could we thank Andy for...
Thank you.